Good morning. I want to talk about alternate reality jumping, reality shifting, whatever people call it, quantum leaping. I really liked that show, and now I'm in it. So, I, uh, I'd say 2 years ago, I know it was 2020, is whenever I first really started noticing the posts that people were making about reality shifting. And, I was pretty intrigued with what it was that people were saying, and not necessarily because I believed that anything was actually happening. It was very similar to things that I had seen posted by people in, for instance, the soul bonding community back in the mid 2000s, early 2000s. These were people who had a bond with a certain character or a certain historical figure or whatever to the degree that they could hear them in their heads and felt that they had like a telepathic or empathic bond. Would sometimes like dream as them, or the people would give them commentary as they go around. And there are various theories about how this was working, but mostly people were just in like focused on the social aspect, which is like, hey, which characters in your head and what's your interactions like, and mine's like this, and then a lot of people got into arguments over who had the real Sephiroth in their head. To give you an idea of what was really in at the time, uh, the two big characters I heard of that were fought the most over were Sephiroth and Duo Maxwell from Gundam Wing. So this is deep in the past. And I never actually joined that community. I just kind of watched it. I had something going on that was similar to what they were talking about. I had an anime character who I felt a resonance with, and I was interested in whether the community was having similar experiences to what I was, and I really couldn't tell if they did because the community blew up. It did not survive. Basically, the who has the real Sephiroth was eventually the drama that killed it all. So that happened. It passed, and then I moved on in life. Now we're over here. And I find it really interesting that this reality shifting thing has um, become really strong, especially during the isolation of the pandemic. The soul bonding thing was happening in like the early days of the internet. When I say the early days of the internet, it's not the earliest. Like I got onto the internet back in like 1994. And this would have been 2002 or so, 2001, 2002. By that point, you're starting to get Web 2.0, but it's not really set in all the way. Web 1.0 lives right alongside it. The dot com bubble and the dot com burst have both happened, but like the full impacts of them haven't really set upon the internet yet. GeoCities has been sold to Yahoo, but it's still up. So it's easy for me to remember this right now because it's a little bit closer to me in memory than like right now is. And part of the reason is because I did a jump. Um and I want to talk about the jumping that I did and what its effects were. Um Partially the jump connected me a little closer to that 2000, 2002, 2004 era. Like 2001 is really when it kicks in. There's a weird separation between the 90s and the Y2K era. That's pretty much instigated by the Y2K bug, in my opinion. Um, I find it interesting that there's so much retro stuff on YouTube right now. Right or whenever people are talking a lot about time travel, because so much of the retro stuff I'm finding is basically from a time that I've been traveling to. Um, so the time travel or the alternate reality travel or whatever, how does that work? What is it all about? Pardon me, it's medical. Um, well, I have I have been given advice by various entities, some of whom seem to be other reality jumpers or who the heck knows what. For all I know, I'm talking to the secret masters that Blavatsky was referring to in the Secret Doctrines. Something tells me it's not going to be exactly like what she thought. One of the things that really stuck with me was that you need to be aware, and by you, they were saying that me, I needed to be aware. I was told that I needed to be aware of whether or not I was experiencing something as the first time I experienced it or whether it was a memory. Which was weird because I thought that I could tell the difference between, you know, live and Memorex. But it turns out that you can actually be present in a situation in multiple ways as multiple different aspects. I don't want to say multiple different people because I don't want to get people too freaked out. And it doesn't have to be to that extent. So I prefer to go with the least amount of theory and just kind of start small. So you can basically travel to memory is what I think a lot of alternate reality work, reality shifting, quantum leaping is. And jumping to memory is a bit weird because sometimes you can jump to the memory of a place, like a place remembers what happened in it. So you jump to the memory of a room, and then you can join with the memory of something that happened in that room. Or you can jump into the memory of an object, and then whatever that object has been around and witnessed, you could access the memory of that. And whenever it comes to a person, you can access the memory of a person, animal, whatever. What's important to realize is that since time travel is happening at the same time while you're experiencing memory, the entity that you're in the memory of is experiencing live time. And I don't know if jumping into their memory is perceived by them as some sort of incursion or kind of personality interference. Because whenever I experience this in real life, or like not really, I don't say like saying real life because that doesn't quite define what I mean. Live time. Whenever I experience this in live time, um, sometimes I'll notice kind of a layer over my thoughts that is like extra on top of what it is that I'm experiencing. And the last couple of times that I've noticed that, I've started just like acknowledging it and saying, "Okay, I think this is this is me traveling in my memory now. Kind of like this is an extra layer of me, and I need to pay attention to that." Now, I can make all those theories all I want, but does it make any of it true? Well, here's where it gets a little complicated. Um, So I've experienced some strange phenomena in the last couple of years, and they kind of fold into the time travel and alternate reality jumping stuff. Um, One of the big things that happened is that I received a massive electric shock. Um, I'm not going to go into the details of how it happened because how it happened is so convoluted, it might as well be from Homestuck. And you don't have to have read Homestuck to know how convoluted it is. So just trust me here. The massive electric shock was real, had real effects, and happened in a very convoluted manner. Also, I want to add, I'm safe now. It's not going to happen again. We have prevented further electric shocks from going to happen in the place we're in. And whenever I say that, I mean that, yes, this did happen in my house. So I received a very large electric shock in, I believe, 2019. And it happened while I was in the shower. So I was also in a large body of water. It turned out that right after it happened, somebody was able to help me and get me to my senses and, keep me from like drowning or whatever. I landed on, I I was pretty safe how I landed, but the thing is, the memory of it was very strange. I can remember before and I can remember after, but um, I could remember the before moment where I'm just relaxing and I'm just kind of like leaning against the wall. And I can remember the after moment where I'm on my back looking up at my partner. But when I look up at my partner, and it's 2019, I remember my partner from when it was 2015, 4 years before. And I don't know why. For just a moment, my brain is in 2015 and 2016, and I'm wondering how this person is leaning over me in the shower, because at that time I didn't live with them yet. So um I basically I had to put a towel in my jaw to keep my teeth from, like, my teeth were auto chattering. My jaw was going nuts. So I just had to like put a towel in there to keep it, my teeth okay, and just kind of had to clench on it. And I swear it took like 5 minutes for that to stop happening. It was a while before I was able to get up, to get up all the way. It was like I was sick, and I have not been the same since. Now, am I saying that all this reality shifting has happened due to the electric shock, or that all of this is basically the symptoms of receiving a massive electric shock? I am not saying that because I know that I have other conditions that can contribute to what it is that's happening with me and what it is that I'm doing. And also, I just don't believe that it can be entirely attributed to the shock. However, I do know what the shock did, which was it activated parts of my brain that had been dormant for a while. And after that happened, I started having to deal with the past very randomly in my life. I'd have past memories come up, and they would be very heavy and present. I've often been living in my past in a way while I've been in this present, and it's like I've been time/memory displaced to whenever I was a child or a teenager, to 5 years ago, to being, with different people in a different life, basically, in different lives. And that's just to do with myself. There's some times where I've displaced over to like JFK's life, and I'm just gonna openly say that one. Um, like, a lot of reality shifting stuff people can't talk about a lot because it's too sensitive. Same with like dream work, past lives, and all that. So I'll call this an experiment because everything else felt like it was happening to me, but this one actually felt like it was pretty on schedule, like pretty easy to observe. And so the JFK stuff that started happening was simply that I started getting either JFK showing up in my life as a spiritual visitor and giving messages in whichever way he did, or things about JFK were showing up in my life in ways that were chronologically just weird. Often I would speculate something about JFK, and then I would immediately afterwards find some sort of research confirming that speculation that I had, or the spirit of JFK would tell me something, and then I would be able to look it up immediately and find out it was correct. It would be things about his family that I never knew. I personally had not really researched a lot about JFK until this point. I was interested in the JFK assassination conspiracy and the JFK assassination whenever I was like 11 or 12, because that's when JFK the movie came out, and I ended up coincidentally seeing it and then doing a lot of research to find out what the heck. Well, wouldn't you know, those are some of the memories, like that time period is when a lot of the memories I've been kind of randomly visiting are. So I don't think that I was JFK in a past life, but I have noticed a weird connection or weird details about JFK kind of ever since I started this experiment. And I think that JFK has been kind of a test case. If you want to try jumping into the memories of someone who has long passed and is like a big part of history, go ahead and see what happens. I'm not going to tell you not to do it. Um, I would say that it was actually very useful in my case and very helpful. Now, keep in mind which figure you're going to go to. I'm not even sure if I decided, but I randomly ended up visiting slash crossing over with JFK, and like, he ended up being a figure who could give very good advice and was very helpful. Um, and the way that kind of intersected in my life in ways that I never expected, I never planned, I never anticipated, was very strange to me. But it it wasn't the only way in which things were intersecting. A lot of times, like memory itself is, like I said, a part of time travel. The past was trying to teach me something, and often it would be through the figures of the past. Um, I had a period earlier this year where I was doing a lot of art inspired by Andy Warhol, and it was either doing pictures that referenced other photos and figuring out how to fair use it, as it were. Or at one point, I had actually done a portrait, and I wrote on it, "Shoot this canvas." And I had this idea. It was actually for NFTs, and I know NFTs, like, it's not the time for NFTs, and I don't know if it'll ever be time for NFTs. But my idea for an NFT was pretty cool, in that I had decided, like, hey, what if you released an NFT of an image that you then destroyed in some manner, so that the digital image was the only actual copy of the original picture, because the physical was no longer viable. Like, it was completely changed. And I was like, what if you shot the canvas so it had like a bullet hole through it, and maybe you had like a some kind of paint. Like, what if you shot it with a paintball, so that, like, the paint splattered all over the canvas, and now it's a new piece of art, but the old piece of art is gone. And then I, at the same time, had been watching the news when it came to art auctions, and Warhol's photos of Marilyn Monroe, a set of shot portraits, um, had ended up auctioning at like Sotheby's or one of the or Christie's or something, and like going for a historic amount of money, of course. And I looked up what the shot portraits were, and he had basically taken a bunch of, like, he had done a bunch of prints of Marilyn Monroe, and had actually gone and shot them with the gun, like the actual photo. And he had been focused on Marilyn Monroe for a while as kind of a creative period, and it was after her death. There were a lot of controversies about his Marilyn Monroe work. To, is this exploitation of a celebrity death? Is this an artistic statement? Is this something else? What I didn't realize was that Andy Warhol had been shot. He had actually been shot by someone, and had clinically been pronounced dead, and they managed to save him at the hospital. And he had been haunted by it ever since. So the shot portraits were not just a gimmick. They weren't just a piece of artistic expression, like, oh, isn't this a neat idea? Isn't this a cool symbol? They were a reflection on his life. He had become a public figure, and someone tried to assassinate him. It turned out that it had been someone he knew who had basically made some sort of, like, weird mistake. Like, they had thought that he was stealing the script to their play, and it turned out he just kind of misplaced it, and they decided to shoot him over this. He ended up dying from it years later. Basically because he had avoided getting operations after that time because he was so afraid of the hospital. All of these things, all of these details have relevance to the life I've been living over the past couple of years. I have had either some stuff in my life that has been reflective of this, or other people in my life have experienced things like this. Like, this is, it's been weird to find people who aren't in my life at all, like Andy Warhol, and find these weird connections to things that are happening in my life right now. So at the time that I decided that I wanted to do alternate reality jumping, I had already been shocked previous to that. That's part of where the time stuff comes into play. I didn't really realize it at the time. We had not worked out that what had happened at that time was an electric shock. We worked it out afterward whenever we worked out a couple of other factors that were happening. And so a large electric current going through the human body and the human nervous system and the human brain is accessing and activating so many different things. And after that point, my awareness was different. It was actually very difficult to handle. I had essentially gotten activated very randomly to a kind of higher psychic level, but with no preparation whatsoever and no one there to help me with it, because this isn't something that people do yet. I think at some point in the future, or in some reality or something, there are humans who are psychic and they engage with technology electronically. Like, there's some Matrix style technological integration where you hook a computer into your brain, and the electrical current is shared between you and the computer, and that encourages, like, that facilitates the exchange of information, but it also amplifies the human body's ability to use its psychic abilities, and you start getting actual telekinesis as opposed to randomly knocking things over. Well, that's not happening right now. And the human body is not currently evolved to actually deal with that right now. But it is an ability that the human body gets later. Imagine if our appendix actually gained an ability. This electricity thing, part of the reason why I ended up even finding this out is because I've been trying to look up things about my own brain. I had a brain injury as a child involving a car accident. So, that's why, scar, go from here to here, entire head. That happened whenever I was like 4. So, not only, by the way, did it scar my head, but it turned my hair curly. Before that, my hair was straight. It was like, it was like, after that car wreck, my identity shifted a bit. And this kind of stuff takes on new meaning for me whenever I look at the reality shifting work that I started a couple of years ago, but really started whenever I received the shock, but really affected my entire life backwards and forwards since then. Memory itself seems to be kind of a portal between realities. And I don't think that it's impossible that our pasts are able to be changed by time travel. That's a weird thing for me to say, but I just find it very strange that our society is as capable as it is right now with information and technology, yet no one's figured out that it doesn't really make sense that you can claim someone's memory from 50 years ago as evidence in a court of law. Um, just as you could claim a piece of paper. Like, the only difference is is what the jury thinks about it. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be able to claim someone's memory from 50 years ago in a court of law. What I'm saying is, if that's so reliable and so infallible, why aren't we doing anything else with it? Because like, it's ludicrous to me that we just depend on memory like we do and we don't question it at all. um and maybe this is because it's actually very hard for me to memorize things, and it always has been very difficult for me to memorize things. But what's strange is that I'm able to remember things very well whenever I'm looking for it. Whenever it's like a detail that I'm trying to find, I can, like, you know, my memory is very extensive, and it can find a lot of things. It's just that memorization itself, like being able to take in something and then regurgitate it very quickly, is something that's very difficult for me. After the electric shock, how I learned just kind of shifted. And this is where we get into the Millennium problem. So there are 10 Millennium problems. And obviously, this became a thing around the turn of the millennium. Basically, there's a center or foundation or something that's backed $1 million behind 10 different problems that have legendarily remained unsolved in physics and mathematics and etc. And someone threw down the gauntlet on Tumblr saying, hey, if all these reality jumpers are so cool and can actually do stuff, then why don't you go solve one of the Millennium problems with all your reality jumping? Go find the math over there. And I was like, huh, that sounds really interesting. I want to try that. And the thing is, I personally, at the start, whenever I decided to pick up that gauntlet, had basically the level of math that we're looking at here that I was capable of was like, imagine a student who had forgotten most of their trigonometry, and that's as far as I got. I will say I managed to pass college algebra, and matrices were pretty accessible to me back whenever I was taking that, but I'd have to actually like look through the instructions again on how to do matrices. Did not do very well in calculus type math. Always very get confused about logarithms and exponents. Like, I just, whenever I look at an exponent, I can't really estimate what that size of that number really is. It doesn't mean very much to me. Why am I going to solve a Millennium problem? Well, partially because it's like, well, can you use reality jumping to skip having a physics degree? I have the library of a nuclear scientist in my house now. The same house that electrified me has several college notebooks, most of, if not all of, the academic papers, the dissertations, physics books, manuals, like mathematics textbooks. All of them are signed and dated. He said where he got them, so all of them are very, very tied to his memories. I looked him up. He passed in like the last 20 years. I know it's a big range, but I don't want to say too much about his details, even though you can look him up. It just seems weird right now. And that's Jerry. And Jerry, I basically have Jerry's ghost in my house, is how I feel, because I have his stuff, and his stuff is personal enough. Like, one of these books is a Christmas present. There's a note inside from like a fellow scientist who might have been either from Switzerland or from might have even been from Soviet Russia, because it was a book from Moscow, printed in Moscow during the USSR. Like it was 1969. This is some crazy, like, spy level shit in my opinion. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, how did this end up in my possession? Why did Jerry's family sell this? I bought this stuff on eBay. I managed to figure out that the seller who was selling this stuff, at the time I was looking for nuclear stuff. I was like doing research on Yang mills in 4 dimensions, which was the problem that I wanted to solve for some reason. It has the most to do with nuclear physics. It'll be really helpful for fusion, from what I've read. Um, I decided to just kind of get a nuclear library to supplement my occult library. And I kind of noticed at the time there are a lot of very interesting materials on eBay. And this was right as the pandemic was setting in. Like I started this right around January 2020, February 2020. And I managed to get a lot of books before all of the shipping went up. And also, there's a bunch of stuff about nuclear in the news in the last year, but that wasn't happening back in 2020. So the materials were a bit more available, and I think, certainly lower priced because inflation hadn't hit yet. So, am I giving a time traveler a humble brag? Yes. But that's how I started looking for the materials that ended up all being Jerry's. I found this one seller who was selling a whole bunch of nuclear books and then all of these papers and stuff, like scientific papers. It turned out to all be from the same guy. Like I would look through the photos of the books that the seller had on auction, and I would check in on the seller would show that there was writing inside the book on the inside cover. So I would just look at the photo, and sure enough, it's like Jerry, 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 Jerry. Like they're all his books. So I didn't get every single one of them. I have kind of I've had psychic input from Jerry, which I like. Again, if you're Jerry's family and you think I'm some sort of crank, it's okay. Just move on. Um, I don't know what to say or do about that element of it. He passed about 17 years ago. So and he was pretty old. But I'm going to find people who knew him in his field. That's part of my goal, is I want to actually find out more about Jerry, because I have his stuff, and his stuff has given me an understanding of nuclear physics and nuclear war that I never realized I could actually achieve, to the point where I've been able to watch politics and call shots on how the war is going to go. And when I say the war, I mean almost any war. If there's a war that has nuclear weapons as a factor, I will be able to analyze it, and I will probably tell you how it goes or how it went, depending upon where in the past this is. And I couldn't tell you exactly how I know. I just know that I've been studying chess and chess masters all my life. I have been studying Cold War politics, Cold War figures. I have been studying actual spies, watching spy movies, spy comedies, reading stories by people in history about espionage and the Cold War, and especially reading about how nuclear stuff works, the physics, the bombs, everything, what Fallout does. I know all that. I knew a bunch of that before I even started the Millennium Problems thing. I just didn't remember that I knew all that. It just happened to be casual interests of mine I happened to do. That's where I think the time travel thing really needs to be examined when it comes to reality jumping. A lot of the focus on reality jumping and alternate reality stuff, this was whenever it was a big trend on TikTok a couple of years ago. The focus was on hey, I jumped into Draco Malfoy, and actually he's a really cool guy. A lot of people were doing Draco Malfoy stuff. Um, and I don't really know what that means, but I just know that the focus was on, like, fictional characters, and that there was surely there's an alternate reality where they actually exist. And then the books we're reading are inspired by someone looking into that alternate reality, is kind of what's supposed to be the explanation for that one. Um, well, I haven't really been doing fiction work. I've been doing past figure work instead. And I think that a lot of people who have been doing fictive work, if they reflected on it, they might find that they're actually doing work with past figures instead of fictional people. Consider Harry Potter itself, like the universe, the witches and wizards universe. It really, what if they were time travelers? Like, what if witches and wizards were actually time travelers instead of, like, using magic in quotations? Because, like, everyone's pretty much examined how the magic in Harry Potter doesn't really make sense or have any logic, right? We've all talked about that. How they have all these weird little devices. They don't understand muggle stuff in quotations, but, like, they all seem to be stuck in the past in some way. They all have old fashioned stuff. Well, it sounds like they're a bunch of time travelers from the past. So if you have an alternate reality approach to this, what if, the people in Harry Potter are, say, in an alternate reality where it's a lot more steampunk and they have a lot more psychic abilities and integration of human ability into their technology. And then whenever they interface with technology from this universe of ours, they just don't understand how to use it, because most technology in our world um, requires a lot of foreknowledge to use, like requires training for you to be able to use, and it takes time to be able to learn how to use it, and most of the technology builds on your memories of having used it before. Like a child growing up now is going to use an iPad or an iPhone, and the usage of that iPad and iPhone is probably going to inform how they use technology that's developed in the future. Like, there's going to be new technologies going forward, they're going to build on old technologies. So having been here all this time means that you could just use that technology most of the time, and you have that confidence, you have that ability. But a time traveler or a universe traveler, alternate universe traveler, coming over here and jumping into, like, our reality here would have a lot of difficulty using our technology, because they wouldn't have all that foreknowledge. And a lot of times whenever you kind of jump realities, you don't necessarily have access to all the memories that are there in the person you jumped into. It's like, you have your current consciousness and your memory of all the stuff that you just now did previous to the jump. That kind of replaces the live memories of the person who you jumped into. Like, it's kind of it's a replacement of the short-term memory. Like, the long-term memory is more accessible, but the short-term memory and some other kind of technological kind of memories, sometimes they're not as easy to access. They're a lot more kind of part of the visual cortex, or part of, like, the active, very fast thinking brain that is always kind of engaged with itself and doing its own things, and you can't really disrupt it. So, like, it can be difficult, basically, to access certain memories whenever you jump over. So, um, I think that people who were having experiences with Draco Malfoy, maybe they were experiencing something like an alternate universe where they're very steampunk, it seems like the past, or they're jumping into the past, into a figure in our past who seems like a wizard kid because of, whatever status he has. And we have to also remember that there are actual witches and wizards in our real world that we're living in right now. Whether or not you believe that their magic is real, they are witches and wizards. They call themselves that. They use wands, they wear robes, they cast spells, they do rituals, they talk about the Philosopher's Stone. The only reason J.K. Rowling was able to write these books is because This already happened in real life, and she's writing fiction based on real life. That's the whole joke. Nicholas Flamel was a real guy. And so, like, if she's writing about past figures a lot, basically being like wizards and witches, what if they really are just people in the past? Do I need to find a way in which the experiences of Draco Malfoy reality jumping on TikTok were real? No. I am just using Draco Malfoy as an example because I think it shows how you could be misinterpreting an experience because your mind has certain associations with it whenever the origin of the experience is much different. Like if people regularly experience kind of incursion memories from alternate realities and regularly get alternate reality memories and experiences and thoughts from other selves, how would we explain that if we didn't know that was happening? We don't have something in our society that teaches us about this. This isn't a societal belief yet. Um, and so there's nothing that we can do with this other than say, well, that's crazy. And what do people do with madness? What do people do with mental illness? Well, currently in our current society, what they do is they either take medication or they go to a therapist or they like they listen to some ASMR or something. I don't know. But like they treat it. Or they go on to TikTok and say that they're alternate reality jumping. That's how we're dealing with it right now. There's no convention in our society for handling like alternate reality thought experiences, for handling time travel, for dealing with time in any way that isn't linear. But for some reason, you can use a 50-year-old memory as evidence in court. Um, so it's interesting that we have these double standards. Um, it's it's really really interesting to me that we think like we do and we have a society that's shaped like it is with almost no recognizance that like it's very weird. So am I any closer to solving Yang Mills in 4 dimensions? Yes, actually. um so where I ended up with that is I still need to keep on doing research. I still need to keep on learning math. That's gonna keep happening. It's just gonna be going forward with the study. Where I ended up is that um, the Manhattan Project is responsible for a lot of the physics, like the foundational physics and the models of our physics today, especially when it comes to quantum and nuclear. There are a lot of experiments that were done during the years of the Manhattan Project and then in the eras directly after the Manhattan Project, where basically people were blowing up stuff they don't blow up anymore in ways that they can't anymore. Above ground nuclear testing, Bikini Atoll. Um, One of the things that would happen is after they would do these big explosive nuclear tests, physicists would have like a plane fly through the cloud and they'd study the atoms like in the neutrons and stuff, and they'd be able to isolate like a new element that had been created through the explosion. So they were able to do experiments with new elements and with fission without having to build a particle accelerator for it. They were just taking advantage of the fact that a big explosion had happened with these isotopes in the air. We can only do that so many times, and also it's now illegal. Thank goodness. Um, Whenever you're having to hijack a nuclear test explosion to figure out your physics, that means that your math is slow. The reason I could state that with certainty is that I watched a video recently on the fast Fourier transforms, and basically a Fourier transform allows you to do things with wave calculations that allow signal analysis, and most of modern computing would be impossible without it. Sometime in the 50s or 60s, someone figured out how to do a fast Fourier transform. And the reason that's very important is because a Fourier transform would take you like several days, but a fast Fourier transform could take you 30 minutes. This guy could do it while he was in a meeting, just writing it down during the meeting. So the fast Fourier transform, they didn't have that accessible to them until the 50s or 60s, and the Manhattan Project that started up and had its big heyday during the 40s. So there was a lot of math that you would have to do when it came to physics that they wouldn't have been able to do fast enough if you did it with numbers. One of the things that I've found is that the way that math used to be done, like in the days of the ancient Greeks and Plato and Aristotle and such, Euclid, they would take shapes, measure the shapes out, and then do the calculations by moving the shapes around. Like if this one lines up to this one, this side is the same length as the side of this other shape, and you move the shape over here to this other thing, and those are the same length, then this thing is also the same length as this thing over here. Like, you've probably remembered this from geometry in school. Like, that's like some basic geometry rules they would tell you. Well, the way that they used to do it was they wouldn't bother with the numbers, they wouldn't bother writing stuff down. They would just have shapes. That's why you have the rule. They're like, here's how you prove the rule. Do. Proofs. Um, Now we do most of this in numbers because one, it involves a lot less space. You don't have to have all these shapes sitting around, and two, it's actually much faster to do it with numbers most of the time. But there are some calculations that you could do with shapes or geometry that are either faster or just simply a different methodology, and therefore sometimes just much easier than doing it with numbers. So this way of doing math where you're not really using numbers as the basis for it or as the central basis for it, and you're using shapes instead. This is basically a system using models. And the thing about models is that you also use those internally to think through concepts. During the Manhattan Project, whenever they were figuring out fission, they were figuring out, trying to calculate how big an explosion a bomb would make, and how far the fallout would go, and where it would go, and how long it would last. All of those calculations involve a lot of very complex math, and sometimes they didn't get it right. Sometimes, like the first nuclear explosion that we ever made, the Trinity explosion, they estimated, I think, that it was going to be like 3 or 4 times, like it was going to be much smaller, and it ended up being like 3 or 4 times larger than what they expected in size in terms of explosion, megatonnage, because there were elements present, like isotopes present, that they hadn't calculated for, and those actually increased the criticality of the reaction, and that basically means that it got bigger. Increase the criticality of the reaction is not a phrase I would have told you back in 2019. I will tell you that. But that's how I talk now. I don't find it super strange. There's lots of information I've absorbed. It's just that like I've really shifted as a person to be able to answer this question. It's one of the theories that I had whenever I first took this on was, if I'm going to solve a Millennium problem, then I'm going to have to become a mathematician. And I'm not a mathematician right now. Is this going to mean that my past changes in some way, or that my reality changes in some way so that I can actually gain these abilities? And it kind of has. Like, there's only so much that I can really say when it comes to reality, because everyone's subjective experience of reality is going to be arguable. There's going to be things that you can debate at all times. Um, but it's very interesting now that my life is kind of shaped like these problems. Um, that I have the resources now to tackle this in ways that I don't think anybody would have tried tackling it before. The idea that I have with models is I am an occultist and I already have a basis in Kabbalah because if you do any kind of Western occultism, you're probably going to be involved in Kabbalah at some point. That's just how it's shaped. Um, well, what's interesting is there were Jewish scientists in the Manhattan Project, and they would have probably had knowledge of Kabbalah. And Kabbalah it has a numerology system, and it can be a way of modeling certain concepts, um, including dimensions, including physics. Kabbalah can be used as a model to apply to anything, from what I've been taught. And from what I've seen, it's basically true. I mean, if you can count to 10, you can put it on Kabbalah. Um, it's the numbers 1 to 10. Well, Yang-Mills needs to be solved in 4 dimensions based on a superstring theory that doesn't have just 10 dimensions. But what's interesting is that if you want to bring it up to 12 dimensions or a different number of other dimensions, you can use that with Kabbalah as well. It's not just 1 to 10. There's numerology that there's like a different versions of the tree that bring in, like, there's, I'm not going to say extra spheres, but there's different areas around it. It's kind of like in astrology, you've got the planets, but you've also got like the different lunar nodes, or the shadow moon and stuff like that. Um, like the dark moon Lilith, by the way, is what I mean by that. Um, those kinds of concepts you can apply here as well. So I think there may be a way to model Yang-Mills with something like Kabbalah or numerology to basically model it out instead of using complex written math. Um, the difficulty that I've noticed in physics is that there are not a lot of models and representations of the concepts that they're trying to explain. And when they do have these models, they're like they're very basic. One of the things that I had read about the Millennium problem was that they feel that the tools and models right now to try to solve these problems are inadequate, and they're hoping that if they open this up to multiple disciplines, maybe this will bring in something new that they can, some new way to approach things. Like, obviously what they've tried before isn't working, so what else can there be? So I'm trying to take a cross-discipline approach, but also because I have Jerry's stuff. He got his degree in the 40s, and his degree is in nuclear physics, but it's in philosophy. All of the nuclear physicists were in the philosophy department because there was no physics department whenever the Manhattan Project was happening. And Jerry's dissertation is a dissertation in philosophy. The book that he got for Christmas in 1969, from a fellow scientist in Switzerland from Moscow, is on philosophy. It's the philosophy of particle physics. This approach of it being philosophical, or this labeling the discipline as being philosophical, perpetuated into the 60s, and possibly, like, I think into the 70s. The 80s is whenever you have kind of a new approach to everything, and it's now its own field and its own department and whatnot. But because they were in the philosophy department, not only were there Jewish scientists in the Manhattan Project, but there would have been Jewish philosophers in the philosophy department. There would have been many people in the philosophy and religious studies department, which cross over, um, who would have been informed of different models of thought, various ways of thinking. And the thing is, different religions have actually thought about what is the tiny universe like, what is the microscopic universe like, what was the origin of the universe like. They have actually gone through this and thought about it throughout history in a serious way. Like sometimes they're repressing technology and thought and science, but sometimes they're investing in it and they're trying to figure out like the different levels of reality. And so you can have models of the atom back to the ancient Greeks. You That's why we've got elements like earth, air, water, fire. You had to start somewhere. Um so whenever they were approaching these new problems in nuclear physics and quantum physics, sometimes they would try to solve the problem by looking at it through a different model. And a lot of times they would approach it through like different spiritualities or different mystical systems than they had been using before. It is um, Robert Oppenheimer who quotes the I think he quotes the Bhagavad Gita, um, or the Enuma Elish. Um, Behold, um, it's like something like, "I am the destroyer of worlds." Um, like he quotes this on reflection of the atom bomb exploding. I'm quoting from a religious text, an Eastern religious text. It's not a Christian religious text. um, After an experience like that, to me, I think points to how much the whole project was focused on philosophy or inspired by philosophy, or it was like they were all philosophers. That mathematics is basically a philosophical pursuit if you cannot apply it to war, or if you cannot apply it to something practical like power generation. And so they were philosophers, and I think that they were using the Kabbalah model back then. I think that the math has been passed down from the Manhattan Project. I think that there are a lot of things that were passed down from the Manhattan Project, but I think that when it came to the philosophical approach, when it came to the models they were using in their heads to consider these problems, when it came to the conversations that they had about it that led to their solutions, I don't think that those have been passed down. And I think that they involved Kabbalah, specifically Kabbalah. And I am going to see if there is a way to approach geometry and higher advanced math using the Kabbalistic model. I I don't doubt that I will find some materials that apply to this field, because there are plenty of nerds who love this stuff. Like Kabbalah and mathematics and numerology, like that's most of what Kabbalah is. So that's going to be one of my next steps, is basically trying to apply the concept of modeling to this dimensional stuff to give it a face, basically, and see where that takes me. Do I think I will be able to publish a paper in an academic journal? Not on my own. I think what I'll end up doing is I will do my modeling stuff. I will try out my try to get as far as I can when it comes to my theory, and if I can bring something together that convinces another scientist out there who does this, much more professionally than I do. If I can convince a mathematician to kind of co-write this paper, then maybe we can actually get somewhere. I provide the modeling and the approach, and someone else um, solves for the eigenvalue. I just like I don't want to solve the Schrodinger equation. Um, I know just enough to know that math is dangerous. And it takes days. It takes days to solve some of these. That's the whole point, is that the experience of solving, of trying to work on a problem for days like this and finally coming up with a solution is in itself extremely educational. So I don't know if I'll ever be able to in any way solve the Schrodinger equation, but I will learn a lot more math before I'm done. I know that. Um, how will I end up learning the math? I don't know, because certainly no conventional way. Nothing conventional has happened thus far, but I've learned so much. Um, I just know that, like, this approach to solving a problem would not work for a day job, and I would not suggest you try to do something short term with it. One of the things that I did was I told myself whenever I started this, is like, this could take years. Let it take years. I honestly forgot that it had been 2 years since I started this. I thought for some reason I started this at the beginning of this year. This being the Yang Mills thing, the Millennium problem thing. I Part of the effect of all this weird time jumping, memory surfing, being electrocuted is that the last 2 years are kind of hard for me to remember. So, um, that means that there's really no telling what could happen next. Um, it's really upon reflection that I look at this stuff and I realize just how fast things have been happening, and how extraordinary it is that I have ended up with the materials I've had and had them available at the times that I've needed them, but in ways no one would ever have been able to logically predict. Um, I guess next is the study period. Now I've got some time to just sit down with my books and read them and concentrate, and that will be nice to have. So I don't know what I'll have to show for this and when, but I I think in 6 months I might have a prototype model to show people, to show people on the internet, that it kind of that kind of feels doable, that kind of feels like where we're going. So we'll see if that's the case. We'll see how it works out. That's Yang Mills. That's a update on it. I'll call it a diary entry of sorts, or a vlog. Yeah, this is definitely a vlog. So laters.